These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a light square, along with black's king and queen. Examine every square the knight can move to, and a fork at d8 suggests itself, but d8 is protected by one of black's rooks. You look for ways to pin, capture, or distract the rook, and find none. But before giving up on the thought, imagine carrying out the fork and letting the knight get taken. Ask how the board would look with the knight gone and the rook moved to d8. Methodically imagine any checks you then would have. The most interesting is queen takes at e7, since it's safe and attacks not only black's king but also the now loose rook on d8. How would black respond to the latter threat? With king moves to g8, it would be his only legal move. Now white has the simple queen takes rook, check. Here the fork is just a means to an end, viz., capturing the rook and winning the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a light square, as are black's king, queen, and rook. You try first to fork the two more valuable pieces and so see that knight takes at f6, check. Attacks the king and queen. The trouble is that pawn from g7 takes knight follows. Black's g-pawn can't be pinned, captured, or distracted. But you must habitually persevere, playing the moves in your mind's eye and imagining the aftermath and its opportunities. Think of the board without white's knight and, in effect, without black's g-pawn, which will have replaced his current f-pawn. Examine every check you then would have with every piece. There would be 3, queen moves to f5, queen takes at d4, and rook takes at d4. The first, queen moves to f5, is met with queen takes queen and nothing more. The second, queen takes at d4, causes black to play queen takes queen and then white to play rook takes queen, check. The king moves, and in the end white has traded his knight for 2 pawns. But rook takes at d4, check, is another matter. If black moves his king, white plays rook takes queen. If black plays queen takes rook, white plays queen takes queen. So the original move, knight takes at f6, is a good one, gaining black's queen and 2 pawns in return for a knight and a rook. White to move. What is the best move? White's more advanced knight at f5 has no good forks. The only black pieces on the knight's square color are the king and bishop, which can't be reached from any square within range. White's other knight, though, is on a dark square, d4, and so are black's queen and one of his rooks. So how about knight takes at c6? The square is protected by black's bishop, which can't be pinned, captured, or distracted. But still, if white plays knight takes at c6 and black replies with bishop takes knight, what then is possible? Imagine white's d4 knight off the board and black's bishop at c6, and then examine every check. There are two, knight takes at h6, check. Which doesn't help, and knight moves to e7, check. Which forks the king and bishop. Then it gets even better, black has no alternative but to move his king. White then plays knight takes bishop, winning the bishop and inflicting yet another fork, this time of black's queen and rook. Now it's safe because the bishop is gone. A lesson of the position: anytime a sequence calls for a knight to move in enemy territory, think about whether its move might be a, or another, fork. Remember that every move by a knight changes the color of the square on which it sits, and thus may radically change its forking prospects. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's advanced knight at c3 is on a dark square. So are white's king, queen, bishop, and rook. Examine the knight's ring of possible moves, and see that the king and queen can be forked at e4 but that the square is protected by the pawn at f3. Can the pawn be pinned, captured, or distracted? No, no, and no. Okay, what results if black plays the fork anyway and permits pawn from f3 takes knight? Visualize what is left on the board. Black then has two checks: queen moves to d2 and queen moves to e1, but neither are helpful since white captures the queen in either case. Nor does black have any further knight forks. But remember that when considering an exchange you also want to examine what lines would be opened by it and what pins then would exist or become possible. Here, moving white's f-pawn to e4 would put white's king and queen on the same file with nothing between them. Anytime you see this pattern you should be thinking pin. The opponent's second piece will be powerless to move when attacked if moving would expose the king. Consider this a preview of the patterns we will be studying in our later work on pins. Here black would be able to pin the queen with rook moves to f8 and take it a move later. So the original knight moves to e4, check. Ends up winning the queen after all in exchange for the knight and a rook. If you didn't spot this, it's probably because you haven't studied the art of the pin in any detail, a problem we will cure later. But the next couple of positions also will offer some practice in thinking about pins that may arise after a failed fork. Watch for them. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a light square, as are black's king and queen, calling for consideration of a fork at b6. Black guards the square with the pawn at c7, which, a brief examination reveals, cannot be pinned, captured, or effectively distracted. White nevertheless imagines playing the fork and losing the knight. With the knight off the board and black's c-pawn moved to b6, is anything interesting possible? White has one check, queen moves to e8, but it just loses the queen. He has no more knights he can use to fork anything. But here, as in the previous example, he sees that black's king and queen are on the same line, this time a diagonal. He thinks pin, again, and can impose one with bishop moves to e6, winning the queen. Black replies knight moves to e5, which will allow him to retake white's bishop after bishop takes queen, then white has queen takes at g6. Here the key thing to visualize was white's own knight cleared from the board. The alignment of black's king and queen already was present, the fork serves just as a way for white to move his knight out of the path of his bishop, and in a manner that forces black's response before he can take measures to avoid the pin that follows. One of our general points repeats: in addition to examining every check you would have after an exchange, look for any newly open lines that might allow for a pin or other tactic. White to move. What is the best move? This position is still more demanding. A scan of the pieces on dark squares turns up a knight fork, knight takes at c6, attacking black's queen and his bishop. The latter piece makes a suitable target because it is unprotected. But one must always ask what the response to the fork might be, especially when neither of the forked pieces is a king. Here black has a clear saving move, queen moves to c7, both taking the queen out of danger and enabling it to protect the previously unguarded bishop. As usual, however, this is no reason to give up on the idea. Once black makes his reply, a new color scan or other examination of knight moves would be in order. Now white's knight would be on a light square and so would black's king and rook. So how about knight moves to e7, check? Alas, the square is protected by black's queen, now, in our imaginings, sitting on c7. And yet this still is no reason to give up on the idea, since we always can ask what becomes possible if black then captures the knight. What lines then would be opened? What pins would come into existence? With white's knight off the board and the black queen ending up back at e7, white's e1 rook would pin black's e6 pawn to his queen. A pinned pawn can guard nothing, and in this case the pin leaves black's rook at f5 unprotected. White takes it with his queen. This sounds complicated, and at first it isn't easy to see. But you might be aided by observing a visual pattern trying to emerge. If white's knight could vacate his square, white's rook would pin the pawn that protects black's rook, which could then be taken. The forcing way for white to vacate his knight from e5 is with a fork at c6. Unfortunately black's queen then moves, ruining the pin white is trying to achieve. Fortunately, white can draw the queen back into place at e7 with another knight move to that square. So solving this problem might involve two trains of thought, one that sees a goal and tries to reason toward it, here, creating the pin so the rook can be taken, and one that involves looking at various attacks you can make and what their consequences would be. White to move. What is the best move? Checking the king into position. In all the positions so far, a knight has been one move away from striking at two pieces. We now turn to cases where that is not yet so. Whereas the previous positions typically relied on pattern recognition, you see the structural pattern for a fork in place and look for ways to perfect it. The positions here involve the other side of tactical play as well, examining forcing moves to see where they lead. Most often we will begin the train of thought by examining checks and their consequences. Checks are the most forcing of all moves because the choice of replies to them is so limited. Your opponent has to reply by capturing the piece threatening his king, or by moving his king, or by interposing something between his king and your threatening piece. And often one or two of those options will be unavailable, reducing more the number of replies you need to worry about. In the studies that follow, and often in this book, we will alternate between approaches to finding tactical shots. Sometimes we will start by looking for visual clues that suggest a combination may be nearby, and then experiment with ways to perfect it. Sometimes we will start by looking at forcing moves, checks and captures, and see if any patterns come into view as a result of them. It is worth working in both directions because examining the board typically involves a mix of those two approaches. When you think of examining checks, emphasize the word examine. The point is not to give any check you can, of course, that is a famously bad habit. The point is to consider, before moving, what the results of any check would be, because pushing your opponent's king around with checks is often a good way to generate tactical opportunities. As you develop tactical skill, you will find that always examining every check you can give is overkill and not an efficient use of your limited time. You can afford to quickly dismiss some of them. But at first the danger of overlooking a check and an idea based on it is greater than the risk that you will spend too long looking at such things, so you are better off erring on the side of examining too many checks rather than too few. To restate these general points in the particular setting of this section, a check may move the king into position to be forked, or be used to create a pin, or a skewer, or a discovery, as we shall see later. That is an especially excellent result, because we already know that kings are ideal targets for double attacks. When your opponent is in check, he rarely will be able to use his next move to launch a counterattack. So anytime you deliver a check that forces the king to move, consider whether it has been brought within fresh striking range of a knight or other piece. Let's turn to examples. In the position to the left, white has no fork yet. There are two ways to find the solution. You might look for a near fork and see that if black's king were pushed onto g7, white would have knight moves to e8, check. Or you might start from the other end by examining every available check, asking piece by piece whether you have any way to attack the king and what would happen if you did, what move would be made in response, and what the board would look like afterwards. Here white has just one, rook moves to a8. It requires black to move his king to g7. Now imagine the resulting position and ask what could be done with it by use of a color scan or by looking for your next check. Either way, see that too. Knight moves to e8, check. Forks and wins the queen. White to move. What is the best move? It would be tempting to play the simple queen takes knight for free here, and erroneous. Don't play any capture, not even of a loose piece, until it's clear that you can't do better. Among other things, this means examining checks you can give and their consequences. White has a few with his queen, the most interesting is queen moves to e8. Black's king is forced to a7, the white knight seals off b7, and now rethink the board and ask if new tactical strikes might have become possible. With your knight so prominently posted, it is natural to look for forks it might inflict, which train of thought leads to knight moves to b5, check. White wins the queen for a knight. Black to move. What is the best move? A color scan suggests an almost fork for black with knight takes at f3. If only white's king could be moved to h2. Well, but there is a resource you can experiment with for that purpose, rook takes at h2, check. How would white respond? If he moves the king to f1 or g1, examine the resulting position, he loses his d2 rook to rook takes rook, a skewer. So presumably he will instead play king takes rook. Examine the resulting board. Black's knight will be on the dark square where it already sits, white's rook and king will be on d2 and h2, respectively. So black then forks them with knight takes at f3, check. And gets back the rook, as well as the two pawns captured along the way. White to move. What is the best move? A common sort of position. You might begin by seeing that moving the knight on f3 to e5 creates an almost fork, it attacks the black bishop on g4, and a pawn that is next to the black king. The next thought is to wonder if the king could be moved onto the f7 square by taking the pawn. White has a resource for the purpose in bishop takes at f7, check. You might have reached this same juncture more conventionally by just examining any check you might be able to give, and finding only bishop takes at f7, check. Black can reply to bishop takes at f7, check. With either king takes bishop or king moves to d7. Then what? Redo the color scan, now white's f3 knight, black's g4 bishop, and black's king all are on light squares. Knight moves to e5, check. Forks bishop and king. Notice that black had thought the white knight was pinned to white's queen, but since knight moves to e5 is a check, black has no time to take advantage of this, he has to move the king, and then loses the bishop. Another point to note, the bishop is protected by the black knight at f6. Do you care? No, because after knight moves to e5 the bishop also is attacked a second time by white's queen, so if black recaptures with knight takes knight, white plays queen takes knight and still is ahead a pawn. The question is not just whether a piece is protected, it's always how many times it is protected compared to how many times it is under attack. White to move. What is the best move? Black's king is trapped, it can't escape to g6 if it's pressured from behind. A natural idea for white thus is queen moves to e8, preparing for the kill on h8, but black's bishop guards the square, so white has to look elsewhere for ideas. Start by examining every check. There is just one, rook moves to h8. And black has only one reply to this, king takes rook. Now re-examine how the board will look. White's knight and black's king and queen all will be on dark squares, inviting the fork. Knight moves to g6, check. You could have arrived at the same conclusion by noticing that white can attack black's queen with knight moves to g6 and asking whether there is any way to draw black's king onto the square at the other end of the fork, h8. A common way to move an enemy king onto a square where you want it is to put one of your pieces on the square, attacking the king and requiring it to move onto the square with a capture to defend itself, a decoy. Here the white rook can do the job. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining the consequences of any checks you can give, our modus operandi. There are four: knight moves to e6, does nothing, and queen moves to f8, queen moves to g8, and queen moves to h8. Queen moves to f8 can be dismissed immediately as it results in rook takes queen with no gain. Queen moves to g8 is unhelpful because it is met with king takes queen, drawing the king to a light square, since all white has is his knight, and since the knight and black's queen already are on dark squares, it should be obvious that you would like to draw black's king onto another dark square as well. Queen moves to h8 accomplishes the mission, forcing king takes queen. If the king instead moves to g6 or h6, white plays queen takes queen, as should be obvious if you are visualizing the white queen on h8, it's yet another skewer. Now the white knight and the black royals are arranged for a fork via knight takes rook, check. Another way to see this would be to start with the knight and notice from the pattern of its relationship to the black king and queen that it is just one move from attacking either of them, but that they cannot be attacked at the same time. To achieve a simultaneous attack, one of them would need to be drawn onto a different dark square. This can be done by moving your queen to a square where you want the king to move, and from which your queen gives check, and skewers the black queen to boot, thus requiring black to play king takes queen and walk into the fork. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check you can give. There are 3, bishop takes rook, leads to rook takes bishop, queen moves to g7, leads to queen takes queen, and queen moves to h8, leads to king takes queen. This last sequence is the most interesting one. Why? Because it forces the king to move, which often creates new tactical openings. Here it results in the black king and queen and white knight all being left on dark squares. There is a fork at f7. But wait, what is black's reply to 2? Knight takes rook, check. He can play pawn from a7 takes knight, in effect trading a rook for white's queen and knight. The problem for white, of course, is that the forking square, f7, isn't safe. We have ways of handling that, however. Here, start by taking the piece on the forking square in some other way and see if the piece that replaces it after a recapture might then be loose. Hence white plays 1. Bishop takes rook, rook takes bishop, then comes 2. Queen moves to h8, check. King takes queen, 3. Knight takes rook, check. Forking and then taking black's queen. White wins a queen and 2 rooks in return for a queen and a bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Standard procedure starts with an inspection of any checks you can give. One of them is knight moves to c4. On a board so open you might be tempted merely to conclude that the king then gets away, but don't be satisfied so easily, try to figure out where it will go. It's easy here because many of its apparent flight squares are unavailable, example d4, d5, or e6. Indeed, black has only 2 possibilities, king moves to e4 or king moves to f5. Now look for your next check or, since you are playing with your knight, look for a fork. If black plays king moves to e4, you have knight moves to d2, check. If he plays king moves to f5, you have knight moves to e3, check. In either event you win the queen next move. The important lesson is to observe how improbable a knight fork might have seemed in the original diagram given the distance of the knight from black's queen. It turns out that 2 jumps of the knight can cover a lot of ground. If the first of its moves requires a forced response from your opponent, you may end up with a fork on the other half of the board from where you began. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check, however briefly. There are 2. The first, queen takes at f5, loses the queen, so the follow-up had better be spectacular, and it isn't. But then there is rook moves to h6. Consider black's possible responses. visualize the rook on its new square. If black moves the king out of the way, say, to g7, or g5, taking the knight, white wins the queen by playing rook takes queen, another example of a skewer. So assume black will play king takes rook. Now how will the board look? White's knight will be on a dark square, along with black's king and queen, which can be forked with knight moves to f7, check. So rook moves to h6, check. Effectively wins the queen. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check you can give. There are two, queen moves to h7 and queen moves to h8. As you examine these, you also should notice that white's knight can strike against the black queen in one move. Knight takes at e6, if black's king could be forced onto a dark square on which it could be forked at the same time, white would have the game. Does queen moves to h8, check, accomplish this? No, black replies bishop takes queen, and anyway if the king were to move to h8 it would be too far away from e6 for white to fork with his knight. What about queen moves to h7, check? The difference is that the queen would be guarded by white's knight, which also attacks f7. Thus black would have to move his king to f8 and into a fork. White plays knight takes at e6, check, and wins the queen. We aren't finished. Black of course must move his king once it is forked, so press farther and ask where it will go. Moving it backward along the back rank is out, because white's queen is there. He has to play king moves to f7. Does white then have any more checks? Yes, among others he has queen takes bishop, which is mate. The moral of this part of the tale is that when you have two pieces in the vicinity of the enemy king, and especially when one of them is a knight, always be mindful of the relationship between the pieces, how one can protect the other in an attack, how the knight can seal off escape squares in different directions by virtue of the odd shape of its moves, and whether the ultimate goal checkmate thus might be achieved. Black to move. What is the best move? At present black has no forks, only one white piece is on the same color square as his knight. It might be natural for black to consider knight moves to h3, creating a threat of mate next move with queen moves to f2 or queen moves to g1. But then you think about what checks white would have in reply and notice queen moves to c8, check. A queen fork that would win black's knight on h3. So black scratches that idea and starts by examining every check of his own. There are three: queen moves to d1, queen moves to f2, and queen moves to g1. Queen moves to d1 loses the queen without accomplishing anything. Queen moves to f2 forces white to reply, king takes queen and almost leads to a knight fork at d3, but the square is protected by white's bishop. Queen moves to g1 also forces the reply, king takes queen, but it moves the king to a different dark square. Now black can launch a fork from e2, which is occupied but unprotected, knight takes bishop, check. Thus wins the queen a move later. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check. There are 3, knight moves to e7, resulting in queen takes knight, forget it, rook moves to b8, and rook takes at c6. Rook moves to b8 leads to king takes rook, which is of no use to white. Here, as in the previous example, all white has is his knight, so drawing the king to a square of a different color doesn't help. But what about rook takes at c6? As usual, one must actually visualize the rook on c6 to see all the effects of moving it there. In addition to checking the king, the rook then attacks black's queen, so if black moves his king, rook takes queen. Black thus has to play queen takes rook. When you picture the outcome of the exchange, you realize that it leaves black's king and queen on light squares, just like white's knight, or even without that observation you simply look for your next check and observe that knight moves to e7, check. Forks black's king and queen, winning the latter. White to move. What is the best move? You know the drill, start by examining every check. There are 3 to find: knight moves to h6, knight moves to e7, and queen moves to g4. Start with 1. Knight moves to h6, which forces king moves to h8, or more likely king moves to g7. What check can white then play? If he tries to, queen moves to g4, check. Then black plays king takes knight. So 1. Knight moves to h6, check. Doesn't look very fruitful, at least on inspection of where it leads anytime soon. And knight moves to e7, check. Just loses the knight. But then there is 1. Queen moves to g4, check. If black responds by moving his king, white can play 2. Queen moves to g7 and mate. Since moving the king therefore is out of the question and black has no way to capture the threatening queen, his only remaining option is to interpose something in front of his king. He has to play queen moves to g6. Pause to visualize the resulting position and ask whether you can do anything with it. Yes, the black king and queen are now arranged to be forked by the white knight via knight moves to e7, check. Another train of thought leading to the same outcome might start by observing that white's knight on f5 attacks the g7 square in front of black's king, which is exposed. This suggests the possibility of mate if white can get his queen onto g7. The natural route to that result starts with queen moves to g4, putting the queen on the right file. Black's response is forced, queen moves to g6. Then you see the fork. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check white can give. There are 4, knight moves to g6, knight moves to f7, queen takes at h7, and rook moves to f8. Don't forget to consider every attacker. The knight checks are important because they show you that black's king can be attacked with the knight in just one move. They suggest that white might have a crushing fork if black's queen could be forced onto a dark square. Queen takes at h7, check. Just loses the queen and doesn't help the forking prospects. Rook moves to f8, check. However, permits only one reply, queen takes rook. Visualize the resulting position and see that it calls for a knight fork at g6. Ask whether the square is protected and see that the h7 pawn appears to be on the job but it's pinned. White wins a queen for a rook and a knight. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check. There are 2, queen moves to e6 and, less obviously but critically examine every piece. Bishop moves to d5. Queen moves to e6, check. Loses the queen to knight takes queen. Bishop moves to d5, check. Is more interesting. The bishop can't be taken by any of black's pieces, and black can't move his king to h7 because of white's knight. So black has to play king moves to h8. Actually he does have one other option we will consider in a moment, but let it pass for now. Now ask how the resulting board would look, and see that it would invite a fork of king and queen via knight moves to f7, check. Again, you might have been helped along in seeing this by observing from the start that white can attack the black queen with one move of his knight and wondering whether black's king might be forced by a check onto the dark square at h8 where it could be forked. As noted, black has one alternative to moving his king to h8 in response to bishop moves to d5, check. He could interpose his f8 knight by playing it to e6. But if you ask what checks white then would have, you see that in addition to bishop takes knight, check. He now has the better move queen takes knight, check. Capturing the knight that had previously prevented him from checking with his queen. This would again force black's king back to h8 and allow white's knight fork on f7. With his own knight out of the way, black also would have the option of playing king moves to f8, but this leads to mate on the move for white with queen moves to f7. White to move. What is the best move? Start in the usual way, examine your checks and their consequences. All the checks white has here involve its queen, which can attack the king by moving to b6, d6, c5, c4, c3, or g7. 4 of those moves lose the queen on the spot, but 1. Queen moves to c4, check. Does not. Black can't capture white's queen in response, so he would have to either move his king or interpose something. Which will it be? Don't just think of the queen moving to c4, imagine it there and see that it also would be attacking black's rook, which is unprotected. Black would like to avoid the loss of his rook, and so might play king moves to d7 to protect it while also moving his king out of harm's way. Now how would the board look? White's knight is on a light square, so are black's king, queen, rook, and bishop, all of which can be forked from c5. The only apparent difficulty is the black pawn at d6, which protects the needed square. But an early question about any such case is whether the protecting piece is constrained by a pin, and the d6 pawn is indeed pinned to black's king by white's rook. So too. Knight moves to c5, check. Wins the queen. If black doesn't fall for this by playing king moves to d7 in the first place, then of course white instead uses his second move to take black's rook. It's an example of a queen fork, which is a theme we will study in detail soon, but the general point already is familiar. Sometimes a knight fork, or any other tactic, does its work without ever being carried out. The threat of it forces your opponent to cough up material to avoid seeing it executed. To put it differently, you don't play a move like queen moves to c4, check. Here hoping that black will play king moves to d7. It's great if he does, but you should always assume he will see the trouble coming and will play the best move available to him, probably queen moves to c6, but in any event not king moves to d7. We say the sequence works here not because we fantasize that black will play king moves to d7, but because you are sure to win at least a rook if he plays anything else. Alas, many of the prettiest forks never end up getting played. Going back to the main idea of the position, the tricky part is that the fork depends on the pin of the d6 pawn, which is visible only if you clearly are imagining both white's move, queen moves to c4, check, and black's response, king moves to d7. It is a perfect example of the importance of visualizing not only the move you imagine making but also the move that comes after it. White to move. What is the best move? Using multiple checks. The skill called for in that last problem, the ability, when you examine a check or other forcing move, to keep the resulting appearance of the board clear in your mind's eye, is one of the keys to good chess. It gets even more important as we turn to positions that require you to follow up on a first check with a second one before the fork is ready. Gradually your ability to recognize an emerging forking pattern will kick in as you are examining the checks and follow-up checks available to you. By working back and forth between forcing moves and glimpses of patterns, you build a combination. Begin with the leftward position. Anytime you have a battery of rooks on an open file like this, consider what would happen if you drove them both through to your opponent's back rank. Sometimes the result may be a mating sequence there. Even if not, though, the threat is powerful enough to force results, and forced results always have to be inspected in search of forks or other tactical opportunities they may create. Thus white imagines rook moves to c8, check. To which black would reply knight takes rook, then comes rook takes knight, check. And black's king is forced to f7. If you were looking only for checkmate, you would have to consider the sequence of failure, since the king escapes. But if you're looking for a tactic, the sequence is a spectacular success, as it leaves black's king and queen both on light squares and ready to be forked with knight moves to g5, check. White wins a queen and a knight for a rook and ends up with two attacking pieces on the board against none. Notice how remote the chances for a knight fork by white appear to be on the face of this position. The knight on f3 just seems too far away from black's king. It's a study in the importance of re-evaluating such possibilities whenever you can make the enemy king move. A useful rule of thumb is to ask every time the king moves whether you have any new checks against it. Here that would turn up knight moves to g5 on white's third move. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check. There is only one. Rook moves to a8, check. Black must defend himself. He has no way to capture the rook and can't move his king because both of its flight squares are attacked by white's knight. All that's left is to interpose his bishop at d8. Now what next for white? Look for another check. Again there is just one. Rook takes bishop, check. If black responds with king takes rook, the board looks even simpler than it did at the beginning. Black rook at h8, black king on d8, white knight on e5. The fork at f7 is self-evident.